All right, so a little bit of time, practical challenges about the implementation of lung cancer screening, and there's nothing to declare. So we all know that the initial eligibility criteria was set by the NLST eligibility criteria. Seems natural, right? You have a trial, it comes up smelling like roses, so let's just stick with this eligibility. And most organizations have stepped away from that now. They are actually based upon the Nelson results. They've moved away from the 55 to 74, 77 and 80, down to 50, 80, 20-pack years, and 15 years since quit. So the bar has been lowered somewhat in terms of absolute risk, but the absolute risk is really high compared to the other cancers we screen for. No real explanation for that and no real reason for that, given how high the risk of death is. But all these other organizations changed their recommendations, but they've all retained 15 years since quit. CHEST has one part of their guidelines that doesn't. NCCN has never included 15 years since quit. And when the American Cancer Society went to update its guidelines, we kind of scratched our head and said, actually, where is the data about the continuing risk after smoking cessation? Do we actually have any data? And lo and behold, no, we don't. Nothing. Nothing in the systematic reviews, nothing in the trial manuscripts, not one word on why we should expect lung cancer risk to decline so substantially after 10 or 15 years of risk that the balance of benefits and harms is no longer justify screening. My colleague, Michael Halpern, almost 30 years ago, wrote this article showing that there is continuing risk after people quit smoking. Now, the way that this was interpreted was, wow, look, if you stop smoking sometime in your 50s, you're almost home free. I mean, look at these, continuing risks. But man, if you wait until you're in your 60s or 70s or just don't stop smoking, look at how high and how quickly and more accelerated your lung cancer risk goes. One of the things we've always been doing is comparing the risk of continuing smoking with the risk of quitting. Everybody in this room knows that I'm not denigrating quitting. The quitting smoking is the single best thing you can do if you're a person who smokes. But we have to ask, what is the continuing risk of lung cancer from someone who stops smoking? When I first met Sheila Ross, thank you, Sheila, she brought this up to me and said, the American Cancer Society talks as if your risk just disappears after you quit smoking, and it doesn't. And I thought, well, I need to look into that. All right. So what we did is when we updated our guidelines, we did a systematic review of the evidence. Naturally, we pulled up thousands of articles, settled on 22. And in these articles, we showed that there, in fact, not only does risk of lung cancer persist, but compared with individuals who never smoked, that risk remains significantly elevated for 2 to 3 decades. Paul Pinsky wrote this really interesting article, and I've because it's 8 minutes, right? So I've circled everything to help you when you read these slides. So look at the rate per 10,000 person years in a person who never smokes versus a current smoker. Quite a bit difference, about almost a 36-fold greater increase in risk. And if you go down and look at the people who formerly smoked, and what their rates of risk are and what their hazard ratio are, you see that it continues to remain elevated well past 15 years since quit and well into 30 years since quit, where there's actually a 10-fold excess risk. When we updated our guidelines, we got colleagues at the NCI to help us with some modeling. And what they showed, in fact, is that lung cancer risk continues, especially beyond 15 years since quit, because the effect of aging outweighs the effect of increasing quit years. And in fact, this is startling. That risk for someone with a 20-pack year history after 15 years since quit is rising at 9% per year. That is substantial. These are actually many people who think that their risk is steadily dropping, and we see this in surveys, but it doesn't. It is rising, really quite rapidly. So when we removed years since quit from our guidelines, and we felt that there was a really strong justification for it, the modeling that we did with the CISNET group showed that we would add about 5 million additional people to the eligibility for lung cancer screening. Now, how does that happen? Okay. This is a fascinating graph. So what you see at the top line is what is the number of people who are eligible for lung cancer screening under the new ACS guideline through the age of 80. The very bottom line are the people who are eligible under U.S. Preventive Services Task Force 2021. What you find is that it's very hard to acquire a 20-pack year history and a 15 years since quit history by the time you're 50. Everybody think back to what it was like to try to smoke in high school when every adult is watching you. You cannot smoke much at all. You have to wait till you're on your own. Your volume ratchets up rather slowly. It's sort of like 0 to 100 and then braking to get to that eligibility. And as you see all these lines of participation eligibility clustering at the very beginning shows that most people who lose eligibility since years since quit would lose it after they start screening. And what we see here is a lot of people are losing eligibility. And as they age, that number of people dropping out of eligibility while their risk is rising grows more and more every year. Now, so we've dispensed with years since quit. One of the things that started happening right after the task force issued their first guidelines was an awareness that we had a lot of people developing lung cancer, in particular racial and ethnic minorities, who would not have qualified for screening. Again, another head scratcher. How is that possible? And when the Preventive Services Task Force announced their 2021 guidelines in 2020, colleagues at the NCI looked at the disparities in who would be included in that eligibility and who would not, and discovered that the new guidelines actually increased the number of Blacks and Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans, but the disparities still remained. So in other words, look at the blue bars, the green bars, and then the red bars. The red bars are what you get if you actually estimate risk based upon a life years from screening CT model, which includes the risk associated with a lighter smoking history and a younger age in ethnic minorities, and shows essentially that using these categorical variables to estimate eligibility means that we leave a lot of people who are at qualifying elevated risk out of eligibility. Now, more and more, we're learning that packed years is maybe not the greatest measure to be using. This is really nice work that Alexandra Potter's been doing. And I've highlighted it across the bar here. So if you look at the left, smoking duration is quite similar across racial and ethnic groups, 43 versus 45 years. But when you look at smoking intensity, it's a difference and the median difference of actually 12 versus 20 cigarettes. Pack year histories is 25 versus 49 pack years, which means that you have a lot of risk associated with smoking histories that do not qualify for screening. This looks enormously complicated. Just focus on the white area, which I've highlighted in green in this first box. So looking at Black individuals compared to white individuals, only 61.8% would qualify for screening. These are from people who were diagnosed with lung cancer. At the time of their diagnosis, would they have qualified, versus 82% for whites. When you look at duration, years of smoking only, not pack years, you level the playing field and you eliminate the statistical difference between the two. We're also looking at different ways to use modeling of risk factors to qualify people for eligibility of screening. High benefit is defined as an average of at least 16 days of life that you might gain after 3 annual screenings in 5 years. I know that seems really, really low, but keep in mind, these are days spread across millions of people, and it actually works out to years on average. And so what you can see is that if you look at people who smoked any amount per year for at least 40 years, or people who are age 60 to 80 and have at least 40 pack years of smoking, you actually end up with an alternative that brings more people into screening than the categorical 50, 20, 15 categories that the task force uses. These alternate criteria have higher sensitivity for bringing in people who are at high risk, 91% versus 78%, and they all outperform the task force recommendations for including racial and ethnic minorities. This little graph here shows you, in effect, if you look at the far left column and the far right column, that the inclusion of current and people who formerly smoke and various racial and ethnic groups who are at higher risk all are more likely to be included under this approach compared with the task force's categorical recommendations. So in conclusion, the task force's guidelines are flawed in important ways. Number one, they rely on an RCT protocol to set screening policy. That was a mistake. It failed to identify racial and ethnic differences in lung cancer risk. We have not managed to identify the subgroups at elevated risk and the differences that we need to be paying attention to. We've failed to learn about them. Absolute risk is set too high. We have an opportunity to prevent many more deaths from lung cancer if we just consider the fact that we can bring in a lower risk group who are still at high risk. And we have mistaken assumptions about continuing lung cancer risk. All of the organizations that you would look to have petitioned the task force and CMS to, as quickly as possible, get rid of years since quit. Current methodology for recommending updates every 5 years post initial RCT evidence is poorly positioned for correcting errors and adapting to new evidence. This is especially problematic since health insurance coverage is linked to the task force recommendations. We are failing to deliver equal treatment for equal risk. It's unconscionable. And we need to be impatient about it. So in coming decades, we have a time-limited opportunity to save lives from tobacco-related lung cancer and, for this conference, other smoking-related diseases. And we need advocacy to overcome these shortcomings as quickly as possible in recommendation-based insurance coverage. So thank you.